Thank you for asking me to speak with you today. I wish I could be there in person, but that is not possible. I'm here to talk about, as Stefano said, how disinformation and misinformation targets journalists and how they attempt to delegitimize and neutralize them by doing so in order to destabilize democracy. This is something I've written about a lot in the past few years, because there always seems to be a new example of this phenomenon happening all around us, particularly in the United States. If you're very old, as I am, you might remember a time when the word disinformation wasn't used quite as widely as it is today. That doesn't mean it didn't exist. Propaganda and weaponized misinformation have existed for a long time. Soviet and American spy agencies used to call this kind of deliberate disinformation campaign active measures, and these tactics have been around for more than half a century. That said, as the events of the past decade or so have shown us, the internet, and in particular social media, have accelerated this phenomenon and made it easier for bad actors of all kinds to use it for specific political purposes. In that sense, I think the internet is not the fire, it is the gasoline that helps the fire spread. So in the United States, at least, journalists started to become intimately familiar with these kinds of tactics during the run-up to the 2016 election, the rise of Donald Trump. This is when terms like troll army started to become commonplace, referring to groups like the Internet Research Agency, a Russian government-affiliated entity that helped engineer many disinformation campaigns on social media. And of course, it wasn't just the US. Similar problems started to arise in the UK around Brexit, as well as other countries like Brazil or Myanmar. And in Myanmar, disinformation quickly became deadly and helped fuel a brutal genocide against the Rohingya people. One of the biggest factors in the spread of disinformation is that much of it is distributed by actors or groups that either pretend to be reputable journalistic outlets or somehow convince mainstream media and journalists to help spread their messages. So disinformation is powered by either destroying the trust that audiences have in traditional media or by imitating traditional media, or both of these at the same time. To give you just one example of the imitation problem, Facebook, or Meta as we're supposed to call it now, recently shut down a large and sophisticated network of about 60 Russian websites that were distributing anti-Ukrainian messages and content, and they did so while pretending to be mainstream news sites, such as The Guardian in the UK and Der Spiegel in Germany. And Facebook said that this was one of the largest and most complex networks of this kind that it had detected and shut down. So how many more are out there that we haven't detected? In 2020, more than 20 journalists learned that they had unwittingly joined a Russian influence operation after Facebook and Twitter announced the removal of accounts that were linked to the Internet Research Agency. As it did in 2016, the troll farm created Facebook and Twitter accounts pretending to be legitimate news entities and legitimate journalists, and the agency also tricked freelance journalists into writing stories for its purposes by posing as a nonprofit news organization called Peace Data, complete with fake editor profiles generated by AI software. Axios recently described how a number of journalists had their names, photos, and bylines stolen by malicious actors in an attempt to give credibility to fake news. One reporter said his identity was hacked in order to propagate a right-wing conspiracy theory that the incoming US Defense Secretary was going to outsource defense systems to China. Another had fake Twitter accounts pretending to be him in order to amplify pro-Iranian propaganda. If malicious agents can't hack into or pretend to be legitimate journalists, the next best thing is to convince mainstream media outlets to share their disinformation, which is something many journalists do unwittingly by reporting on such groups and their conspiracy theories or harmful messaging. Even if these stories are negative and critical, experts say that reporting on them and their content can help give these groups a platform and in the process can make them seem more legitimate. Researchers like Whitney Phillips have described this as giving disinformation purveyors the oxygen of amplification. She and other experts advise reporters to consider whether certain types of disinformation have reached what they call a tipping point before they write about them, meaning that the information or conspiracy theory in question has escaped the community where it began and has entered into the mainstream. If this has not happened, then reporting on it could do more harm than good by distributing the messages that these trolls want distributed. In some cases, disinformation networks pretend to be mainstream media or take advantage of it and simultaneously try to delegitimize real journalistic outlets and reporters whenever they can. So at the same time as a troll factory based in St. Petersburg pumped out disinformation designed to obfuscate Russian war crimes in Ukraine and Syria, the same troll factory launched attacks on mainstream journalists and media sources in an attempt to discredit or silence them. When a Finnish reporter investigated this troll army, she was targeted with disinformation designed to discredit her and the outlet she wrote for. Jessica Arrow, who was a journalist with Finland's national broadcaster, was targeted after she asked members of her audience to share their experience of encounters with Russia's troll army. She was soon being bombarded by a campaign of harassment and insults against her and her work. Everything in my life went to hell thanks to the trolls, she said. She was flooded with abusive emails, vilified as a drug dealer on social media sites, and mocked on YouTube. There are so many layers of fakery, you get lost, she said later. Elliot Higgins, the founder of the influential and respected Bellingcat Citizen Journalism Initiative, has also been the target of a steady stream of personal attacks from Russian state media after he proved that Russian agents were involved in the shooting down of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17. The main intention behind most of these attacks is to make Higgins and Bellingcat seem as though they are either incompetent or tools that are being used by others. In another case, after a Kurdish photojournalist exposed torture by Iraqi special forces, he was discredited by the release of misleading videos that suggested that he himself had participated in the torture. Reporters and activists around the world have been targeted with false information and sometimes with malware in a sophisticated Iran-based information operation that used inauthentic websites, news articles, and online personas. One American journalist had his files hacked and then leaked, with falsehoods inserted among them in the real documents to discredit his work. One of the longest running harassment campaigns, as many of you know, is the one involving Maria Ressa, the founder of the Filipino news site Rappler, who's been persecuted by the government of Rodrigo Duterte ever since he was elected in 2016, including being arrested more than 10 times and becoming the target of many spurious legal claims. In her case, the government itself has spread disinformation about her in an attempt to discredit her reporting because she has focused on Duterte's malfeasance and corrupt activities. At one point, Ressa was the target of an average 90 hate messages an hour, according to analysis by the International Center for Journalists. Threatening her, demeaning posts, scrutinizing her professional credibility, and attacking her personally are commonplace. The ICFJ said the harassment campaign was designed not only to vilify a journalism icon, but to discredit journalism itself and to shatter public trust in facts. The director of digital safety and free expression at PEN America has pointed out that the goal of this kind of campaign is to spread disinformation or inaccurate information to pollute the larger information landscape, and at the same time to prove to people that professional, reputable sources aren't reliable, to discredit, intimidate, and silence the reporters behind the accurate and professionally produced information these groups want to undermine. So in addition to attacking individual reporters or outlets, the broader strategy of much disinformation and propaganda is to make people question everything that the mainstream media reports. The Russian government strategy in particular has been described as an attempt to undermine public perceptions of the world and of politics by turning it into a, quote, bewildering, constantly changing piece of theater, unquote, in which nothing can be relied upon. It is what some have called a fire hose of falsehood, with two primary features: a high number of different channels and messages, even if in some cases they conflict with each other, combined with a willingness to disseminate partial truths or outright fictions. In the words of one observer, Russian propaganda entertains, confuses, and overwhelms the audience. The objective is not to win an argument or make a specific point, but rather to sow confusion, leaving the audience unsure of what the issue is or why it even matters. Steve Bannon, the chaos agent who advised Donald Trump, had a succinct way of describing this approach. He said, "The Democrats don't matter. The real opposition is the media, and the way to deal with them is to flood the zone with shit." As one American journalist described this strategy, this is not about persuasion. It is about disorientation. Because once someone is disoriented and doesn't trust anything, they are more pliable and willing to believe almost anything, especially if it conforms to their existing preconceptions about the world. This is similar to the kind of confusion and disorientation that cults engage in order to get new members. The best defense against these tactics, whether it's disinformation or attempts to discredit mainstream media, is to be aware of them and to be alert to the danger of either platforming disinformation or contributing to an overall atmosphere of chaos and uncertainty in which disinformation thrives. Thanks very much for having me today.